In the last section, we took a look at the documentation for the get function, and we noticed that anytime we call get, it appears to return something called a future. So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about what futures are and get a better handle on them. Now, let me cut to the chase right away with futures. If you've ever worked with JavaScript before and you are familiar with promises, a JavaScript promise is identical to a future in Dart. So when you see the word future, you can just think JavaScript promise. It's the same thing. If you've never worked with JavaScript before or you've never dealt with promises, that's totally fine. We'll talk about what they are right now. So let's first get started by taking a quick look at a diagram. So inside this diagram, we've got our mobile device over here that's going to make a HTTP request over the internet to this outside API server. It's going to request some amount of data. The API server will see the request and respond with the data. Now what this diagram right here doesn't show is the fact that it might take some very substantial amount of time for this request to be completed. Our mobile device might have a really spotty internet connection, and it might take this request anywhere from 100 milliseconds to 10 seconds to complete. So we have to assume that it's going to take some amount of time to fetch our data from this API. And that's what that future is meant to help with. Futures are meant to help with code that will take some amount of time to execute, or any event that might take some amount of time to execute. To get a better handle on what a future actually is and how we interact with it, let's work on a quick example over inside of Dartpad. So I'm at dartpad.dartlang.org. Over here, I'm going to first write out my main function. I'm not going to put the void return on this just yet. You'll see why in just a moment. And then at the very top, I'm going to immediately import a package called Dart Async. This async module, as a part of the Dart standard library, has all the support for futures included inside of it. Then at the bottom of this file, I'm going to create a new function. You do not need to write this function. I encourage you to just watch for a moment. It's going to be a function that's going to simulate how that get function from the HTTP package works. So I'm just going to copy and paste it over like so. So we don't really need to know a whole lot about the get function right here that I just copy pasted in. Again, it's really just supposed to kind of mock or copy how the get function from HTTP works. So we can call get and pass in a string, and then at some point in the future, it's going to return some data to us. So let's get a better idea of how to work with the future that gets returned from the get function. Inside of main, I'm going to call get, and I'm going to pass in just some arbitrary whatever URL. The get function doesn't actually make a request, so I'm just pretending like we are making a request right here. So when we make this request, it returns back to us a future that will resolve at some point in time with the actual data that we got back from this fake request. If we just print out the result of the get function right here, like so, then we're going to see up here that we get back a future. So we get instance of future right here. So the future, or whatever we get back from the return or the get function right here, is not directly useful to us. Instead, this future is an object that will notify us when our data has been successfully fetched. So I'm going to delete that print, and instead I'm going to add on up top a print statement that says about to fetch data. And then to get some notification when our data has successfully been fetched, or to kind of hook into this future and be told when the feature has resolved successfully, we can chain on a .then function. So on the future that gets returned, we're adding on a .then function call. This is a function that we can call with a function, like so. Now the inner function that we are providing right here is going to be called with the result of the future. So I might receive that argument as something called result, and then I will print it out inside there like so. So now if I run this code, I will instantly see about to fetch data appear. So there it is. And then 3 seconds later, I will see got the data. The got the data string right here is what our future resolved with. So you can see down here, I'm returning the string got the data. So essentially, to get the data or to get the information that comes back from our HTTP request, we can chain on a .then statement. We can pass in a function that will eventually be called with the data that got returned from that API endpoint. Now there's one other way of working with promises, and this other way is a lot more convenient than worrying about this .then thing right here. So I'm going to delete the code I have right now and only leave behind the print statement and the get. So the other way of working with futures, and this is the much more easy and straightforward way of working with them in my opinion, is to use a slightly different syntax called the async await syntax. So again, if you're coming from the JavaScript world, this is probably going to seem pretty darn familiar. Our get function right here returns a future. We can wait for that future to be resolved automatically and get the data that comes back from it by adding the await keyword in front of it. Now, whatever this promise resolves with will be returned from this overall await call. So I can say var result equals async, or excuse me, var result equals await get blah blah blah. Whenever I use the await keyword right here, I have to mark the enclosing function with the async keyword. So right after my argument list up here, I'm going to add in the async keyword. And now I should see that error go away. All right, I'm going to zoom in or zoom out just for a second so we can see that whole line like so. So by adding in the async keyword right here, it informs Dart that our function contains a future, and it needs to, at some point in time, wait for that future to be resolved before continuing execution of this function. So the async and await keywords go together very closely. After awaiting for the result from this get function right here, we can then freely print out the result, like so. So if I now run this code, we're going to see about to fetch data, and then 3 seconds later, got the data appears as well. So again, throughout the rest of this course, we're going to use the async await syntax because it's extremely effective and very concise, but just so you know, we could also as easily done the more classic .then syntax like that as well. Totally up to you which way you want to go. You will see some documentation that uses the .then syntax right here, which is the only reason I show it to you. In fact, if we go back over to the HTTP package documentation and go to the main page, right here, you'll see that they use the .then syntax here as well. So you will see the .then syntax used in documentation, but for you and I, we'll use async await. Okay, so that's a little bit more on futures. Let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section and handle the future that we get back from our GET request right here. So I'll see you in just a minute.